Mike Sheppard studied his hands. They were large, calloused things that seemed foreign to him in the dim lighting. He flexed them and watched as the veins wormed beneath the skin, folding and pulsing until they became four hands, and then just vague splotches of watercolor. He shuddered and averted his eyes to the window. Looking outside, he tried to enjoy the sunset as the Greyhound sped toward his family home. He watched the scenery congeal and feather away, manipulated as if forced through a Photoshop filter. No point on focusing on anything then. Everything outside was a blur, the images washed and muted. His eyes were unable to fasten to a point. Thus, he gave up that game and resigned himself to staring at the seat in front of him. Sleep had been sporadic and painful. The crook in his neck was a steady pinch that every now and again escalated to Vulcan death grip intensity. The pain rose, his vision blurred. Wash, rinse, repeat ad nauseum. He released a heavy sigh and believed that he was dreaming, as that delusion would at least grant an illusion of sanity. Maybe he was crazy, being driven crazy. In the window, Mike glimpsed a hazy reflection of himself. He looked sad and haggard and broken. The brown bush of his beard unkempt and thinning head of hair untamed. Literally driven crazy. Somehow he remembered that a withering mind affixed to nothing of permanence, and his gaze danced with a kaleidoscope of images until his eyes teared from the strain. He raised his sleeve to his face and hurriedly wiped them. Through blurred eyes, he recalled a line from the song Brain Damage by Pink Floyd.
There's someone in my head, but it's not me.
As the bus cruised, his engine whirring loudly, the mechanical rumblings of the vehicle began to lull him. Yet his neck still bothered him, so he knew rest wouldn't come. Looking away from the window, he remembered what happened and questioned it, pushing it around his mind like a little marble, knocking it against other possibilities, all of them scattering and rolling out and away. He knows it was just regret welling up. He recalled her beauty so strange and yet common, a dichotomy he thought was quite sad. Her lips whispered dead wishes he wanted to hush away, but they persisted. He understood how her anger was a blister that throbbed at her back, posing all reason as a fist. He could not talk to her. Not now. She had brought everything around him to a crashing halt. There was nothing to do about it. The past is the past. Failure or success rising like a brick wall built without a hole or hinge to stand forever as a testament to either. Directly across from Mike, an elderly Hispanic woman wheezed and coughed, her jowls jumping each time she put a fist up to catch her spittle. Her head was covered in a colorful bandana of oddly asymmetrical patterns. Silver and gray peeked from underneath. She was a bit overweight, shown by her ill-fitting red coat, tight brown pants, and white blouse. She definitely seemed uncomfortable in her seat and reminded him of his great-granny Lisa. God rest her soul. This started him thinking about the implications of time on the mind and the body, about death and where it leads, and if his death would even matter. Did he even want to get as old as that woman? His Granny Lisa was damn near an invalid when she went. Half her body useless due to a severe stroke in her 70s. And she lived for 11 more years like that. He didn't like to go visit her around that time because she couldn't speak, and the house smelled mostly like urine and mothballs. Now, unfortunately, he could smell the old Hispanic lady. It was a foul miasma that hovered around her, something akin to morning breath and dirty clothes. It wasn't even close to morning, unless we're mourning whatever died in her gut. That little joke almost made him smile. Instead, he crinkled his nose and began to breathe through his mouth. It seemed cruel to live that long, a fate worse than death, and he thought, "Oh God, stretch me out. Stretch me out upon fine linen and gold-flecked mahogany and shut the box. Shut it, and don't you open it." Mike thought he understood death as it applied to human beings. Seeing as there's enough pain and anguish in one life, why would one want to be subjected to another? One is plenty. You go through love and pain and loss several times over, enduring each, absorbing the experiences like water to a sponge, only to release it upon death. It all falls away in horrid tatters and spotty pieces in the end. Pieces that you'd rather leave in the dirt to dry and crackle and crumble to the dust from whence it came. 6 feet deep. And God takes your soul on up after all that time. Very welcome to it, if you ask Mike. Wherever that may be. Or maybe you get dragged to the pits of hell, wherever it is. He doesn't want to come back to this place.
Shut the box. Shut the box and don't you open it.
Shauna was tired of him. Bored. Likely disgusted. And he saw it on her face. That unmistakable sheen of ennui. He imagined her rolling her eyes behind his back as he went on and on about playing Final Fantasy VII. About how the game was deep and had so many esoteric, existential messages that spoke to him, called to him about life, death. Specifically, the antagonist, Sephiroth. There was something about him. That something quickly developed to an obsession that only put more holes in the windows of a dilapidated house. Still, Mike felt compelled towards uncovering the nuances of the game character which reflected his personal ideology. He refused to call these instances coincidence. He just didn't believe in it because everything has a reason. All things are intertwined. As his old chemistry teacher, Mr. Morton, said, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That was science, right? How could one argue with such an axiom? She said he was conflating the two, but he knew that she just didn't understand. She had never understood. All his life, no one had ever made an effort to understand him. He knew that now, and she was just the last in a long line of people that had dismissed him as crazy. Mike gave Shauna examples, written down, cross-referenced, and annotated. She usually just laughed and called him stupid, and went back to painting her nails. One time, she was especially crude. He told her about the scene where Sephiroth spoke to the protagonist, Cloud, saying, "What I have shown you is reality. What you remember, that is the illusion." Now, of course, Mike knew Sephiroth was talking to Cloud about his falsified memories, so he took it a bit further, suggesting to her, what is reality? What if we are living a dream? He mentioned how it reminded him of the Hindu concept of Maya, which is the veil of ignorance that hides the truth about the world and reality. It struck him dumb at that time because he had recently discovered Hindu schools of thought related to the nature of the universe. When she looked at him then, he recalled her eyebrows were like jagged brown check marks that punctuated the seething anger on her face. She slapped his notebook out of his hand so hard that it hit the wall with a loud whack. Then she told him that he needed psychiatric help, and she was tired of him avoiding life. After she stormed off, he picked up the notebook and wrote down a question. Playing games to avoid life? He knew this was just a game, but there was a part of him that just didn't want to let it go, no matter how crazy he appeared. He decided to take out that same notebook and jot down what he'd been musing just then. It was nearly full now, every page from top to bottom inscribed. He had made sure to leave the last few pages just for the trip. He knew that he'd see something, or be reminded of a thought he let go during the week, and he would want to write. He pulled his JanSport backpack from the empty seat beside him, noting that his neck felt better. Thankfully, he had gotten a seat to himself, because the seats on Greyhound buses were already uncomfortable without having to sit next to someone. A small mercy indeed, but appreciated. Behind him, Mike heard someone giggle. More specifically, the giggling of a young boy. Funny, he didn't remember seeing a boy board the bus, and they hadn't even made their first stop. But his mind had surely been on other things. He did like to make it a point to pay attention to his surroundings, however. He could have sworn that he looked at every seat on the bus, given that his own seat was only 4 from the rear. He let go of the thought and proceeded to unzip his bag and pull out the black notebook. It was his favorite and the only one that she had purchased for him back when the relationship was still new. Half as thick as an NIV Bible and considerably wider. It had a significant weight to it, a portion of it attributed to the solid pewter belt clasp on the cover. He felt powerful holding it, as if the words within held some glorious revelation only he could fathom. It was something that he could hand down to his children, if the time ever came. Mike smoothed his hand across the front of the notebook, holding it up to his face for a moment, admiring it, then unbuckled the clasp. He opened to the bookmarked page that he'd been working on before he left, flicking the attached red ribbon over the edge. It was just dark enough on the bus that he would have been straining to read on, so he turned on one of the overhead lights. The light reflecting off the pages made him wince. But he fought through the glare and brought his eyes to the last paragraph he had written. It was exciting to see the words because he had taken great care to transcribe them directly from the game. He felt they were so significant that he replayed the scene several times just to absorb the full equity of the quote. He read the words of Sephiroth to himself, quietly and with reverence. While speaking to Genova, he said, "You should have ruled this planet. You were stronger, smarter. But then they came, those inferior dullards. They came and took this planet away from you. But don't be sad, Mother. I am with you now. We meet at last, Mother." See, what she didn't understand is that Mike wasn't trying to take the game literally. He wasn't some puerile deviant, lost in a false world, pining for it to become reality. No. It was just that when applying the idea to the real world, the seeds of all these ideas took root. He had pondered that for a long while, the idea of something other than human, even superhuman, ruling the planet. We know that the planet is over 4 billion years old, at least by scientific carbon dating standards. If we are to believe that, then would it not stand to reason that something else just as intelligent could have existed in all that time? The dinosaurs dominated the planet for quite a long while, until they were suddenly wiped out, the so-called Ice Age. Then man appeared, conveniently, to pick up where they left off. Was there something that paved the way for us to live here? Could we have been designed by God to rule this planet after He wiped the floor with whatever was here before us? Something stronger? Smarter? There was another chuckle from the rear of the bus. It seemed to be a mocking laugh, sort of a that died as fast as it emerged. Tired of speculating about real or imaginary children, Mike stood up and looked toward the back of the bus. The seat behind him was empty, but the one behind it was occupied. A younger white gentleman was sleeping soundly, his blond head resting against the window. The next two seats didn't have anyone in them that he could see. No longer wanting to guess, he decided to get up and do an actual count. He replaced the bookmark and shut the notebook, not bothering to fasten the buckle. Stepping out into the darkness of the aisle, Mike drew no glances from anyone. They all were either preoccupied or sleeping. He started the count from the front, making sure to double-check each seat. The count brought him to 12 total passengers, including himself. The driver made 13, just 13 people, and no kids out of the bunch. Understanding that, the only thing that made sense is that the guy behind him was playing a trick. The Hispanic woman had been snoring for the past few minutes, and there were two people sitting behind her. They were a younger black couple. The man had reclined his seat as far as it could go, and an Oakland A's fitted cap covered his face. He was surely asleep. His companion, a petite, light-skinned woman with a round face, was reading an unidentifiable issue of OK magazine. There were only 4 people in close enough proximity to have laughed where he could hear. Mike looked to the rear of the bus again, studying the sleeping white man. It had to be him. The high-back seats made it hard to see his face, and a shroud of darkness fell against his form. He looked towards the front of the aisle, checking to make sure all was clear. He didn't want to go and spy on this guy, but it was unnerving to have someone laughing behind your back. Figuratively or actually. It just felt disrespectful. Mike did his best to sneak towards the back, minding each step as he went. He used the headrest for balance, emboldened by everyone's casual willingness to ignore other passengers. As he approached the seat, he noticed that the man had a huge black bag sitting in the seat next to him. It looked heavy and took up the entire space. Beside it, he was now slumped over, chin on chest, with part of his face pressed against the window. Something about the scene was odd, and the man didn't seem to be breathing. His nose was close enough to the window that condensation should be forming. There was none. The bus suddenly rolled over a series of bumps, jarring it enough that Mike had to grasp the headrest firmly to remain upright. Then he watched in horror as the man's head slid limply forward along the window and hit the back of the seat before him. The squeal of his skin against the window was sickening. One of his arms came forward as well, and hung loosely off the edge of his seat against his thigh. It was clear to Mike that the man was dead. He stepped back aghast, nearly tumbling over the armrest and into the seat behind him. Mike steadied himself as his breath caught, and he swallowed so hard that he heard it above the rumbling of the bus. He thought the guy couldn't be dead. Not for real. People don't just keel over and bite it on a greyhound. No way, Mike whispered to no one. No damn way this guy's dead. What in the actual hell is going on? His voice sounded shaky, scared. He looked around again, noticing no one stirred in their seats. He looked back to the man's limp body, watching how it slumped so lifelessly in the seat. Suddenly, he felt a gust of cold air against his neck, and he shivered. That bit of air was enough for him to notice he had begun to sweat. Perspiration trickled down his neck and to his back. Something in him needed to rebel against this fear that seemed to have gripped him. He thought then that his friends would laugh at him. They would call him a fool, a chicken. Most especially Shauna would laugh at him. He could see her tossing her auburn hair back from her shoulders, flipping it mockingly, and turning her back on him as she laughed her haughty laugh.
No, he wasn't a coward.
He couldn't be a coward because Sephiroth wasn't a coward. He resolved to face the fear, to get it over with. He would just buzz the guy a couple times, shake him, maybe even check his pulse. This would put to rest any doubts about cowardice.
Pull it together, Mike. WWSD. What would Sephiroth do?
Mike steadied himself against the headrest of the seat in front of him and the slumped man. Taking a deep breath and exhaling furiously, he placed one knee on the seat next to the man, careful not to brush up against his bag too much or put significant weight on it. When he did, however, he felt something give, then settle into the bag. He paused for a moment because he just didn't want to think. Something just moved in the bag. He waited for a few seconds and noticed no other movements.
One thing is for sure, this whole situation is creeping me the hell out.
In the last few minutes, darkness had finally descended upon the bus. In the distance, sunlight lost itself, its final remnants of orange and scarlet decaying fast. Mike scooted himself forward on one foot, with the knee of his other leg still resting in the seat with the bag. Mike reached above the man to turn on the light. Knowing that the light would illuminate the situation much too clearly, he hesitated to turn it on. Sometimes it is better to imagine what a thing is like than to be confronted with reality. Reality and truth are always more brutal than speculation. In the end, his courage saw him through, and he pushed the button. What Mike saw there made a chill run down his back. He felt his eyelids raise in shock, the disbelief now subdued and replaced by terror. The man was white as a sheet, and his neck held a ring of purple and yellow-hued bruises in the shape of small fingers. His reddish blonde hair was stiff against his head like that of a mannequin. His head lay at an odd angle against the window, just as if it had been broken. In fact, leaning in closer, he saw that it was broken. And at that faint protrusion of bone was a small hole. It looked like the indentation of a drinking straw. A tiny crust of dry blood had formed at the edge of the hole, and the skin was raised, red, and swollen. The air seemed to grow colder as he raised a very shaky hand to the man's shoulder. Before he was able to touch him, the laugh came again. This time it was coming from all directions, a multiplicity of eerie echoes pouring into his ears like music through headphones. Mike, startled by the abruptness of the sounds, lost his balance and fell forward into the man in the seat. If there was any doubt of his death before, it was surely dismissed now, as Mike's hand had pressed firmly into the man's chest, only for it to give way like styrofoam under his weight. The resulting crunch emitted after Mike's hand entered the dead man's chest cavity was uniquely horrifying and gut-churning. Aghast, Mike yanked his hand away, feeling a slimy, gelatinous ooze coating his hand and wrist. The only obstruction to full contact was the man's dress shirt, which he'd worn without a t-shirt underneath. Mike screamed in horror, flailing his arm like he was trying to fan an encroaching blaze. In the light, he could see very well the mixture of blood and pus and mucus that coated his hand. He took the man's jacket sleeve and began to wipe vigorously until he could no longer feel the goo between his fingers. He breathed heavy, and and wiped at the beads of sweat forming on his forehead with the back of his hand. Suddenly, the bus lurched forward, and Mike was thrown awkwardly against the back of the seats. He fell to the floor as he heard the screeching of brakes and the hissing of air. Unable to recover completely, Mike slipped to the floor again as he tried to get up. He cursed aloud. What the fuck? But the bus had stopped and was awfully quiet. Using a seat for leverage, Mike pulled himself up. Outside, he saw nothing out of the ordinary for a stretch of country road. Just long, wide fields and darkened trees contrasting the dying light on the horizon. Slowly, he made his way to the front of the bus. Oddly, his steps echoed loudly, as if he was in a space much higher and deeper. The pitch of the taps swept up and around him till they seemed to boom and bang like shattering cymbals. Gunshots. Still, he walked on unsteady legs, groaning as the sounds battered his eardrums. Something was murdering his equilibrium. Anger boiled up in him, and he felt mad tears welling, drifting to the corners of his eyes. Much like the argument with Shauna, the one whom he loved that did not love him back and mocked him instead. Her taunting laughter began to cough at him with each step until it became those steps as well. And he remembered how much he hated her then, how much he wanted her to hurt as much as she hurt him. When she walked away that night, he called to her. He asked her to come back. He even said that he was sorry, but it wasn't enough for her. Her final insult was to turn her back on him and walk down the stairs saying with a heart so cruel, "We're done here, Michael. I'll come back and get my shit tomorrow, but we're done. Done. You and this fucking gang can go to hell." She kept walking but would not listen. And then she tossed that blonde mane across her shoulders so wickedly, dismissively. Then she laughed at him. Laughed. Like he no longer mattered. But Michael mattered. He would show her that he mattered. He just wanted to stop her. So he grabbed that wonderful mane of hair and pulled. Just a little. But he guessed that she was so caught off guard and the moment was so perfect that she lost her balance and slipped down. Michael let go when he saw she was falling, but it was too late. He recalled how her legs buckled, how her ankle twisted awkwardly in her black pumps, the sickening crack of her neck breaking as her head hit the step reverberated through the bus. Through his mind, Mike wailed as he saw her laying before him, neck craned unnaturally backward. Her dead eyes glared at nothing, the chilly blue irises surely appropriate for the scene. Her lips, once full and luscious, now smeared with red. Her blue jean skirt was raised slightly, a portion of bare buttock peeking from beneath. One shoe remained on her right foot, the other lay next to her right hand, which had been positioned behind her when she fell. Her limbs looked like marionettes by the terrible angles they held. Her golden blonde hair, still so lovely even in death, added a framework of light to her face, a sad image of beauty broken before time could wrest it from her grasp. It was an accident. Everyone would see that. Mike knew that he didn't touch her body afterward simply because he would be the first one they'd call, the first one they'd want to blame, but no one witnessed it. It might be a couple of days before anyone even found her body. And when they examine her, they will find that she simply slipped and fell and hit her head. He wouldn't even have to explain why he left because the ticket had been purchased well in advance. Open and shut case, as they say. Mike shook his head, trying to ward off the strange hallucination. Still, it remained. He stepped forward again, walking cautiously, and looked to see if any of the passengers were aware of the phenomenon. He passed up and down the aisle several times, the ache in his head building. The seats were all empty, including the driver. Not a soul but himself. Even the dead man was gone.
There's someone in my head, but it's not me.
I have to be dreaming, Mike said. Wake the fuck up, Mike. He slapped himself across the face a couple times. He closed and opened his eyes. He even pinched himself. Nothing would rouse him from the nightmare. Mike swallowed hard and could only shudder as the sound issued from his throat became a dense warbling that buffeted the windows of the bus. Bewildered and confused, Mike thought only to move forward, staggering from the onslaught of sound. The front of the bus seemed to stretch on for miles now. The aisle twisted like a road, winding around itself and into a maze of seats that loomed like skyscrapers. The rusty spires rushed toward the ceiling of the bus and cast shadows that moved with wicked momentum, shifting in the crevices of the giant chair legs. Mike turned uneasily as he stared upward, finding himself in awe of the power in this vision. The plastic, metals, and multicolored fabrics of the seats coalesced into corrupt semblances, nothing short of viewing funhouse mirrors on an acid trip. Mike ran on before the aisle cascaded into a wreckage waterfall of ripped fibers and metal. He strained and scraped at air as he was poured down into a pit of broken lights and torn seats. He dashed forward through them, crying terribly, tripping and falling as he went. Some of the jagged pieces tore into his pants and shirt. Blood seeped down his arms through numerous gouges and gashes. The wound on his leg felt like fire poured into it. Mike was afraid to even touch it, to look at it. Mike nearly slid to his doom as the graveyard of seats terminated in a nearly unnoticeable edge. He cried out as he stood on the precipice, his heart thundering in his chest. The bus doors appeared below him, surrounded on all sides by deathly sharp pieces of fallen wreckage and other debris. Seeing no other way out, he dismissed his hesitation and jumped down from the cliff, aiming for the center of the door. As he fell, the childish laughter returned, a rich cacophony of impish peals that seemed to delight in his suffering. Shauna's laughter. Mike screamed again as he slammed feet first through the doors and into pitch black. Surprisingly, Mike landed on his feet, but he was a bit jarred from the jump and he felt a stinging sensation travel up from his feet and into his ankles. He groaned dizzily, trying to balance. The maw of darkness encroached, and the only light was the faint glow of the opening above. The laughter was gone as well. He turned around in a circle, looking in all directions, afraid to leave the lone patch of light. Behind him came a faint sound, like a rush of wind. He turned toward it, only to be knocked off his feet. An impish figure passed through the imposing darkness and entered the beam of light, shuffling on all fours like a monkey. It was small, with patchy green skin and a hint of corded muscle beneath. His face seemed too long and mouth too wide. There were two slits in the middle of his face that was likely his nose. If it had eyes, they could not be seen. The head was smooth where they should have been. Thin lips curled around jagged teeth in a treacherous grin. His mouth opened as if to snarl or growl, but Mike was stunned to hear that same childish laughter. But it wasn't laughter at all. It was mimicking the sound, just like a parrot, a freakish, murderous parrot. And it kept up that laughing sound, its mouth agape, like a baby bird needing to be fed. It shuffled over and Mike could hear its nails scraping at the wreckage. It was feeling its way over to him. Mike hadn't said anything or made any sound, so maybe that laugh was a way that it located prey, sort of like echolocation for bats. Whatever it was, he thought it best to stay quiet. Suddenly, something fell against Mike's head. Already on edge, he was so startled that he made a little yelp. He thought to cover his mouth, but knew it was already too late. The thing was upon him. The tiny figure was imposing in that darkness, for he could only make out the abnormally shaped mouth as it hovered over him. It smelled of rust and unwashed skin. The thing breathed wildly, excitedly, probably enthralled that his prey was so close. It pounced. Mike put up an arm to stop it from biting into him. The damn thing was amazingly strong for its size, and it thrashed around like it was having a seizure. The jagged jaw snapped and clicked madly. Being pushed through the debris on his back, Mike could feel metal poking into him. That gave him the idea to search for a weapon with a free hand. He then felt something thin and wet slide across his cheek. It had licked him. Thoroughly grossed out, Mike realized his strength was quickly fading. He had only seconds to find something before the creature overpowered him. Quickly, he patted at the debris to his left and ran his arm across pieces of junk until he nearly had to reach behind his head. There he found a piece of metal, probably a chunk of a chair. It was heavy enough that he could use it as a club. He gripped the metal firmly and found it was unencumbered. In the darkness, it was hard to tell exactly where he would hit it. Mike pushed the beast up enough so that he could at least see its head as it contrasted with the light in the distance. His left hand swung around hard and fast, catching the thing with a glancing blow to the mouth. Mike felt the makeshift club vibrate against teeth as they broke. The sound of it made him shudder. It was like nails on a chalkboard. The thing screeched, then let out some awful childish keening. It made Mike wince. He swung down hard on it again, hitting it squarely in the middle of its head. The wailing became a whimper. He positioned himself for another blow, but before he could land it, the bastard slammed into his chest. They both tumbled over a pile of junk and into another dark pit. When Mike regained his senses, the night sky had returned. The bus was gone, and he was standing in the middle of a 2-lane highway. The sky showed no stars, but the moon was an enormous light bulb, bathing the area in an eerie luminescence. It was a haunting sight, for the road only stretched into more darkness. But there was something there, in the distance. He didn't know what it was or how he could tell, but Mike felt a presence. Up until now, he had not chosen to address the fear that gripped him, but he no longer had a choice. The chill pushed at his heart, and gooseflesh rose like rivets on his pale skin. All of his senses strained to disconnect from this fantasy. Every fiber of his being wished for release, for mercy. But he was just a passenger on this ride to hell. Any entreaties would not be heard, for there was no one with which to plead. The presence moved nearer. Mike felt the air change, taking on a dense, warm quality that made it hard to breathe. He coughed to clear his throat and noticed a metallic smell in the air as well, something like copper. He thought that it could be blood, but it was soon confirmed by the scent of rot and decay, reminiscent of roadkill. He raised an arm to cover his nose, coughing again, and stepped back. 100 or so feet in front of Mike, the darkness began to shift and part like strands of oily, black hair. It waved and swayed, alive and ignited with purpose. Mike could only watch as the darkness crept along the road squid-like, advancing and retreating in a mesmerizing dance. For a moment he watched it slide forward, the mountainous mass of darkness, and he was awestruck. It wasn't until he saw the pallid hand emerge from the center of its pitch-black folds that he ran. He turned and ran as if the devil himself was at his heels. Mike hollered and coughed and spat as he ran, every now and then looking back. The darkness was not advancing as fast as he was running, which was good. What was not so good was the fact that he could see something coming out of the dark. He didn't know what it was, and he didn't want to find out. He just kept running in the opposite direction of the thing. Knowing that he wasn't a runner, Mike understood he couldn't keep running for much longer. It had only been 2 minutes and he was already slowing. He glanced to his right and left to see if there was anywhere that he could hide. But as far as he looked, there were only open, desolate fields. He slowed to a jog and shortly thereafter a brisk walk. Every now and then he looked behind him to see a dark figure advancing. Ahead of him, the road stretched a few hundred feet before it seemed to terminate abruptly. There, the wall of pitch stretched infinitely across the horizon. Mike had prided himself on his ability to collect himself at times of extreme adversity. He recalled being cornered by a rabid dog as a child. That day it had been extremely hot, and the dog was likely hungry or thirsty, but regardless, it was on the attack. Mike ran into an alley with a large rusty dumpster. The heat made the alley smell like death and baked shit, but Mike knew that he would have to jump in the garbage to escape the dog. It was the only option at the time, and it saved him from some very painful hospital visits. He smelled to highest heaven when he left the alley, but at least the dog was gone. He always believed there was a way out of everything, just like Shauna. This was the proverbial rock in a hard place between which he'd been thrown. His head swiveled back and forth, viewing each of the inevitable traps and finding them inescapable. He would have to face one or the other. As if speaking about it sparked curiosity, the carbon-colored tendrils began to trace the ground in front of him, creeping along like accelerated vines. Glancing behind him, he saw that the dark figure was approaching, fast. Mike had nearly forgotten about the ache in his leg, possibly due to the rush of adrenaline, but the pain was back, and it roared like a bonfire. Another pale hand poked through the dark wall that had appeared on the road. It was followed by a mass of hairy protrusions, silver in hue. They wiggled and waved through the black, flowing down along the road, tracing it just as the dark tendrils had before. Then there was a face, gray and wet, followed by a brownish-red glob of tissue, as big as a hog. It pulsed, beating like a heart would. Shortly, Mike saw that it was connected by various wires and tubes like a massive black and blue umbilical cord to an umbilicus. Indeed, it was attached to this thing's stomach. Next, there was a foot, clearly feminine, and another arm and foot. Lastly, there came what looked like a large helmet of glass and metal and wires covering the top portion of an exposed cranium. On the left side of its back was what looked like a horribly misshapen wing. On his right was another protrusion which Mike assumed to be the beginnings of a wing. It had not formed well at all, and it was just a stump of pallid flesh. The silvery hair flowed around what seemed to be breasts. The horror before him was female in shape, but stood at least 7 feet. Where the silver hair covered the breasts, one side seemed to part slightly, and Mike swore he could see a huge eye roll around before it was covered again. The great heart lay in the road, beating so strongly that Mike could feel it vibrating through the ground. She raised her head slightly, and the huge metal crown that she wore shone in the moonlight, so fiercely that it seemed regal. She raised her arms out in front of her, palms up, beckoning Mike forward. Entranced as he was, he almost stepped forward, but the sound behind him made him stop cold. Mike had forgotten. He turned around to see something so unbelievable that all he could do was fall to his knees. Scylla and Charybdis, a rock and a hard place. It was Sephiroth. Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII. Although in the game he was just a cartoonish meld of colored sprites, here he looked like a human man would. He looked just as Mike had pictured him so many times. He was very tall, though not as tall as the giant woman thing, and he looked incredibly strong. His silver hair was long and shiny, hanging loosely down his back and shoulders. The signature bangs were parted in two asymmetrical portions to either side of his head. He was dressed in black leather pants and boots and long black coat. Large metal pauldrons rested on each shoulder, like football gear for a sadomasochist. Matching black leather gloves completed his uniform. All this was frightening enough. What made it worse was the 7-foot-long sword that was draped over his left shoulder. Masamune. The blade was so long, in fact, that even from his shoulder, the tip of the blade nearly touched the ground. Sephiroth said nothing, having already assumed his battle stance. The sword glinted in the light, and Mike squinted from the flashes. It truly was a beautiful instrument of death. Mike thought to himself that surely, if this was Sephiroth, then the thing behind him must be Jenova. The name escaped Mike's lips, and he did not believe he'd said it. But there it was, out in the open. Jenova, the goddess, had greeted him. Jenova and Sephiroth both had come. Mike stood before Sephiroth, looking into his jade green eyes. Now that his hero was there, now that he was able to look upon him, he felt the madness encased within his iron visage. The infectious madness that pushed Sephiroth to perform terrible acts. The Nibelheim incident, the massacre at Shinra Tower, the murder of Tifa's father. Acts of courage performed for the greater good. A lunatic is only a lunatic to those that don't understand the vision. Between the gods of the game and under the fullness of the moon, what could be more perfect than to embrace the lunacy? Mike thought of the Pink Floyd song again, and how appropriate the lyrics seemed for the moment. He gathered all the courage he could muster and recited them aloud.
And if your head explodes with dark forebodings too, I'll see you on the dark side of the moon. The lunatic is in my head. The lunatic is in my head. You raise the blade, you make the change. You rearrange me till I'm sane.
Sephiroth said nothing. Masamune was held loosely in his grasp, and there was no movement. The soldier just seemed to be waiting, the jade green of his eyes flickering like a flame. His features were stark in the light of that demonic moon, and Mike thought that if this wasn't a nightmare, he might think he was a real man. He even thought there was a scent to him, a mixture of lavender and olive oil and sweat. He turned and looked on Jenova's form once again, but her face was strangely familiar this time. He began walking toward her, watching as her arms remained outstretched.
Ever closer, the face began to resemble Shauna. The golden hair, the beautiful baby blues. His lovely Shauna. The love who did not love. His broken angel. It was Shauna beckoning ever closer his love. Mike could only answer the call as the hypnotic beat of her heart thrummed against the road like a drum. With each beat, there was a step, and she called to him. She called him forward, and he walked to the heart of his love to love her again. And there, he reached for her, to clasp her hands and feel the warmth in her embrace once again. Because she knew that he didn't mean it. He never meant to hurt her. There was love always. It could always be their hearts, together. The moonlight reflected off her metal crown, so the flashes of light became strobes. Mike squinted to shield his gaze and found that in between the flashes, the face changed. The golden hair became the silver of Sephiroth's. Blue eyes were replaced with an empty socket and one pulsing red orb. Back and forth, the images changed, and Mike grew disillusioned and sick. The darkness formed wild spikes in the air, jabbing and pushing in and out in rhythm with the monstrous heart before him. Mike could only turn away from the barrage as it began to overwhelm his senses. As he did, he saw Sephiroth lifting the great blade Masamune into the air. Moonlight glinted off the steel and the tip of it gleamed like starlight. Mike could only stare in horror, mouth agape, as Sephiroth's sword rushed forward to greet him. "Tell me what you cherish most. Give me the pleasure of taking it away." Sephiroth's words were the last ones Mike heard as he was impaled by Masamune. It felt like a river of ice flowed through his chest, pushing the air from his lungs. Ironically, it was the exact same way that Sephiroth impaled Cloud. Mike reached out to touch the cool steel, but found that he was too weak. His body sagged, then convulsed as he coughed up spurts of blood. A child's laughter rang out in the distance, somewhere inside the shadows. Sephiroth snatched the blade from Mike's chest so that the momentum of the movement flung his body onto the heart of Genova. The sardonic sense of bleeding to death on a beating heart was not lost to him. There, his last breaths were spent looking up into the empty void of that place, wherever it was, wondering about forgiveness and madness and sanity, and the dark side of that strange moon. The giggling intensified, rising in the tumult around him. Mike closed his eyes. It seemed so much closer. They were much closer. Shut the box and don't you open it. Epilogue. The old Hispanic woman was the one to discover that Mike Sheppard was dead. She suspected something was wrong when she heard his head slide against the bus window. He had been dead nearly 6 hours. What was odd, as she told the police through panicked breaths, was the inexplicable hole in his chest that matched an equally mysterious hole in the back of his seat. A slit in the shape of a knife or a blade. And the fact that there was no blood anywhere in the vicinity, not even in his body, for it had been completely drained of it. No one could recall speaking to him, but almost everyone said that he burst into laughter quite a few times. One guy said it sounded childish, nothing like a grown man. The official coroner's report read that he died from impalement resulting in exsanguination, although they never found the object with which he was impaled. The coroner postulated that from the size and length of the wound, the murder weapon was a curved, single-edged blade. The case, of course, remains unsolved. The police found Shauna Stripling at her condo 2 days later, where she lay at the bottom of her steps with a broken neck. Even though Mike was living there, and the cops felt that he left under mysterious circumstances, her death was ruled an accident. It looked as though she had slipped and twisted her ankle while coming down the steps. It was actually something that happened often to women wearing heels as high as hers, which measured roughly 4 inches long. There was no definitive evidence of foul play, but the investigating officers did find Mike's final journal entry to be noteworthy, if not amusing.
I'll see you on the dark side of the moon. The lunatic is in my head. The lunatic is in my head. You raise the blade, you make the change, you rearrange me till I'm sane. You lock the door and throw away the key. There's someone in my head, but it's not me.